One of the things which gets in the way of thinking clearly about environmental justice is a certain sort of complexity. A complexity which clouds our thinking about justice on a global scale. We can spot local rights and wrongs with ease, but we're rubbish at seeing enormous wrongs. I want to focus on this complexity and maybe suggest a way through it, and you can get at it by means of examples. But what I want to do is say that there's a way around this complexity or through it. We can keep thinking about justice despite it. Suppose I walk into a store and shoplift a bottle of tequila. From that tiny bit of information, you can tell instantly that what I did was wrong, and maybe you even know what to do about it. Probably I should be apprehended and the bottle should be returned, and maybe I should be brought to the attention of the authorities and all that. But suppose instead that my life has taken a dramatic turn for the worse. It's not my fault, I'm down on my luck, I'm penniless. I steal the same bottle. There's a wrong in here too, but maybe you're willing to forgive me and let me offer the warning. It's a little more complicated, but you know what questions to ask and how to start thinking about the just response to my action. You know how to think about that kind of complexity, because you can see an actor, an act, a person wronged. That's not true of climate change. Here's a different example. Suppose 500 million people wake up to warm houses and over a lifetime of winters, and they have toast and coffee and hot showers every morning. And suitably fortified, they drive to work, and they get on with their lives. They go to a fine beach every now and then for well-deserved weekend breaks. They have good intentions and live reasonable lives. But the energy that supports their activities comes mostly from the burning of fossil fuels. And so too with their parents and their grandparents, maybe with their children and grandchildren. All of this in conjunction with much else results in a thickening of a band of greenhouse gases, which heats things up. Sea level slowly rises. 50 years later, after the toast and the coffee, a coastal village in China is inundated. Drinking water is contaminated, crops fail, and people starve to death. 50 years after that, people who might have had tolerable lives have awful lives. How do you think about justice in that case? There's no harm. Well, there is harm, but it's eventual. Whose fault is it? No one intended it, and there's no single hot shower or cup of coffee that was enough to cause harm. No single life on its own did any harm. How do you think about justice in that jumbled mess with causes and effects smeared out over hundreds of years and thousands of miles, and no one standing there red-handed with a bottle of tequila? Well, for a start, you can ask yourself an old philosophical question: what is justice? What does the word mean? Well, punishment is called just when it fits the crime. If a genuinely guilty person has to pay a fine or give up a share of freedom in proportion to the harm done by doing wrong. The distribution of goods, say the amount of water which bubbles up from a well each day, might be called just if it goes to everyone equally. If we discover that someone's been sneaking an extra share, say to top up a hot tub, compensatory or corrective justice might demand that he or she give up a share of water in future, maybe taking less for a time until the balance is restored. These conceptions of justice have something in common, and I know this is a cartoon version, and this is very simple-minded, but pretend. Just go along with me for a second. These conceptions of justice have something in common, and that has to do with how goods and resources and benefits, maybe even costs and burdens are divided up. As a first pass, think of justice as sharing something out equally, whether that something is a burden or a benefit. Equal sharing isn't the whole of it, of course, because sometimes there are good reasons for departing from equality, but put that aside again for a second. Well, questions of justice arise quickly when you think a little bit about the burdens and benefits associated with climate change. Think about the greenhouse gas absorbing properties of the planet, the soils and the trees and the oceans. The Earth's carbon sinks. To put it in a simple-minded way, those carbon sinks are a valuable and limited resource. As Henry Shue puts it, I'll quote him, "A huge store of ethical considerations that are irrelevant to unlimited supplies lock in when there turns out to be scarcity." It matters who uses the sinks and how much those sinks are used, because one person's use deprives someone else of a share. And the shares matter, given the way our societies are set up. If you want to eat and stay warm and have shelter, those shares matter. So thinking of climate change in terms of justice in this way can get you going. You can think about historical or cumulative emissions and come to the conclusion that the rich or developed nations have used more than a fair share of the sinks. Justice might demand that they now use less, maybe much less. You can go further and think of the planet's carbon sinks as similar to a common well that I mentioned a moment ago. And just as you might think that more water should go to those who most need it, perhaps the developing world should get more than a proportional share of whatever emissions are going. Thinking about corrective justice might give you further thoughts about who should pay for seawalls in Bangladesh and so on. That's only one way of thinking about justice and climate change, and the reality is no doubt more complicated, and these cartoonish thoughts are not enough. The point is not that they're enough, but that something like this kind of thinking about justice and the environment ought to have more of a hearing. Part of our trouble with thinking about climate change has to do with the fact that our values grew up in a much smaller human world, a world of plenty, with only stolen bottles of tequila to worry about. We have a way of thinking about justice which is fine for hunting and gathering, but a bit hit and miss for reflection on climate change. We lose our way and think stupid thoughts about China and our own recycling. The world is more complicated now, maybe, than it was when human beings first thought about justice. But oversimplified and cartoonish thoughts might help us see through the spatial and temporal complexity to a harsh conclusion. Justice requires that we in the rich, developed world make sacrifices for other people right now, people we'll never know, people that can't pay us back, for harm caused by more people than just us. If you can peer through all of the spatial and temporal complexities and see the similarities between thoughts about using water from wells and thoughts about using up the world's carbon sinks, you'll see that we can't go on as we have, and we can't go on as we are, because doing so is wrong. That thought doesn't surface much in debates about Copenhagen, the economic realities of action on climate change, political truths, or the excuses some governments advance for missing a target or watering down legislation. But the thought is out there, and the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recently said, I'll quote him, I think that what we really need is a new ethic by which every human being realizes the importance of the challenge we're facing and starts to take action through changes in lifestyle and attitude and behavior. That's end quote. We probably all have doubts about our governments taking justice seriously, but maybe we should have faith in the rest of us if we manage to see through those complexities to the real connection between justice and action.